welcome back to my directing class. I'm Miss Kaleigh and I teach acting at Wonderland Performing Arts. And this is, oh gosh, I think it's week 7 of the directing class. So this class is for anyone who is interested in directing in the future, most likely in community theater or educational theater, and it's most geared to teens all the way up through adults. So anybody who would like to direct. We're outside again because it's a beautiful day, and so today, since it is a beautiful day, great week, and it's Mother's Day week, it's Teacher Appreciation Week, of which I am a teacher, and it's also my birthday week, so I decided that we would step away from some of the more intensive, difficult things of directing, and this week we would have a little fun and talk about when directors really make an influence on the production. So we're going to go through some of my favorite shows and how the directors really influence those shows. That's fun for me. So that's what we're going to do this week. If you want to go back and watch any of the previous episodes or lessons of this class, you can watch them in any order. The first week we talked about what makes a good director, as well as how to select a show. The second week we talked about casting and auditions. The third week we talked about blocking and scheduling. The fourth week we talked about how to direct different ages of actors and what's effective with one group and what might be effective with another age group. And last week we started our discussion of play analysis for a director. And we're going to get back to that next week. We're going to continue with play analysis. Like I said, this week I wanted to take off and have a little fun. So a lot of times when we see shows or online or recordings of shows or even live performances of shows, we think that the way we're seeing it is exactly how the playwright wrote it. And in some cases that's true. Sometimes it's a very just realistic representation of what the playwright put on the page, and the director put it up to be as realistic as possible. And we just accept that that is how the show started out. But a lot of shows, directors really go hand in hand with the playwright and help to develop the concept of that show and actually change what the show is going to be in the end. And we can really see that probably most clearly in revivals of musicals and of plays, because we can see how a different director, a different concept can really change the structure, the feel, and sometimes the message of the show. So I want to go into, like I said, a few of examples of my favorite shows and how a director really influenced them. So I want to start with talking about shows that maybe haven't had a revival, but like the initial incarnation of the show is very creative and different, and what the director did there to make that show basically what it is. So my first example is Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812. That's a musical if you want to go look it up. The cast album is on everything and it's absolutely wonderful. And there's a performance of the Tony Awards that you might want to go look up as well on YouTube. The director, Rachel Chavkin, she got with Dave Malloy, who is the composer and writer of the show, and they really developed this concept from the very beginning of how this show might be told. If you don't know the background, the story of the show, it's actually a retelling of about 70 pages from War and Peace. So if we think about War and Peace, we might think about you know, that very certain type of style of behavior, of dress. I mean, it's Russia, you know, in 1812, and so we think very formally with War and Peace. At least that's how I think of it, and I'm an English teacher. So but Rachel Chavkin and Dave Malloy really turned it on its head, and through her direction, the show and that subject matter took on a very different view of things. They decided that they really wanted to play with the idea of it being set in like a Russian supper club where the actors were performing all around the audience, and really including the audience in the performance, which if we think about, you know, a show 1812, very formal, it's almost the opposite of what you would think of. You think of, you know, how I directed The Little Foxes. You think of something up on the stage, that this is telling their story. It's away from you because it's so far in the past, maybe we can't relate to it as much. So they're showing us, you know, like a glimpse, a piece of history. And War and Peace definitely reads that way. So the idea of bringing it modern, bringing it today, and it kind of being like an opera, because they say in the very beginning, in the very first song, you were at the opera, and they're going to tell you a story. So they set it up with a framing device almost of these Russian supper club actors performing this section of War and Peace for you. And so Rachel Shavkin in that really did something interesting with it. She took away that formality of Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet and of War and Peace, and brought the audience right into the action. In certain scenes of that show, they actually, they take chairs and they put them in the middle of the audience members on stage, and they sit down with the audience members and they have a conversation via song with the audience members sitting right there. They even use the audience as stand-ins for certain people that they're talking about and stuff like that in the show. All of that is director decisions. So a director can really influence what a show ends up being the first time it's put on stage. I mean, the first time they mounted Natasha Pierre, it was in a tent in the meat packing district, and they ended up having to change that a little bit to put it off Broadway, and then adapt it to put it on Broadway. And when they made the set on Broadway, they tried to as closely replicate what they had been doing with this tent Russian supper club idea, and they brought audience members on stage. The stage actually came out into the audience and did this like circular thing, and it was one of the more expensive sets to put up on a stage, which is one of the reasons it's not currently touring, is because trying to put that atmosphere and do that all around the country would be very difficult. But so Rachel Shavkin had a very, very influential hand in directing what that show was going to end up being. I mean, and if I were to go and direct Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet, even though those elements are in there, it doesn't have to be a Russian supper club. We could view it differently as the director of that. The main thing is to tell the story and to serve the story and to serve the themes of the story and get that across. So another example, I love female directors, y'all. Rachel Shavkin, she just also recently directed Hadestown on Broadway. And she once again took a unique vision and shaped Hadestown into what it would be. This idea of it being kind of almost a New Orleans, Great Depression, jazz, South setting in which to show all of these things. And it definitely adapted and changed from its off-Broadway incarnations up until what it has become on Broadway, with really playing into that machinery feel of it, really playing into this idea of spring and growth versus darkness and machinery. It was this thing that she did, and that comes across completely in the clips that you might see of Hadestown. And you might not necessarily have originally thought, a show about the Greek gods would have that, Great Depression, machinery versus growth thing. But as a director, that's something that she brought to it. So just looking at things in a completely different way. And you can do that with your shows. Probably the easiest / most fun to play around with and to adapt to a different setting, a different way of looking at it, are Greek shows, Greek plays, and Shakespeare plays. I was in As You Like It one time, where they brought it into 1800s, 1700s France, with the powdered wigs and that very high court idea. And so when they went out into the forest of Arden, it was very much this between the two of this very powdered wig, mannerism style, and we're playing in the forest now. And it was great setting because it really showed the dichotomy of this is what happens in court and this is what happens in the forest, which is a huge play into the theme of As You Like It. So it worked so well. I've seen clips of an RCA, Royal Shakespeare Academy production of Julius Caesar that they set in apartheid South Africa, where they're presenting it almost as if the time when they were rebelling against the empire and against colonialism and stuff like that. They didn't change any of the script. It's just by setting it there, they're able to show some of those parallels between what we're dealing with now or have dealt with in history and what Shakespeare was writing about. So those are some of the most fun to play around with, and directors are consistently looking for interesting ways that they can retell this story to maybe bring out the themes better by potentially setting it in different places. Now, if the story is completely told via the setting or the particular characters, obviously you can't do that. If it's about slavery in the American South, then you need to set it about slavery in the American South. If that's going to be the telling of the story and that story that you're telling, because I don't believe that you can get across those ideas, like if you're mounting Gone with the Wind or something like that, I don't think you can get across those ideas because the world is not the same place as it was. So there's going to be specific things that you really don't want to play with. You don't want to put, certain things in like space or something like that. Just certain ideas wouldn't work, and you don't want to be creative just for the purpose of being creative. You want to be creative to find new and interesting ways to get across the author's message of the story and to serve that story a way that might be better than it's been done before. Mm-hmm. So now I want to talk about some shows that maybe changed and in their revival potentially got across more than they did in their original production. So far I've hit a couple of original productions that were really unique and different and shaped through the director's vision. But if we think about a show like Pippin, in the very original, which it's amazing, you can see it right now on Broadway HD, the original cast of Pippin with Ben Vereen and everything, that has a framing device of the story of Pippin being told by traveling players, obviously. And this group of traveling players is very much like a vaudeville type of thing. A lot of the different characters are kind of vaudeville archetypes that are told in that original production of Pippin. And it's very much, we're actors and traveling, and this is what we're doing. When Diane Paulus approached this material in the 2000s, she decided to not go with the vaudeville idea, but to turn it on its head a little bit and to reinterpret it as being circus performers telling the story of Pippin, which, if you think about it, it works perfectly because it highlights, first of all, America, and we today don't have as good an understanding of vaudeville as they might have had when Pippin first came out because we're more separated from it. We have a much better idea of what a circus is and what that means. Secondly, the idea, that double connotation of the word circus, of meaning something that is, an actual circus that's being put on, and also something that's like overblown fantasy, and maybe there's something behind it that's not true, because we say, oh, that's a circus, when we're talking about something that's a bigger deal than maybe it is. And so the idea that this story of Pippin is a circus, well, if you know anything about where it goes in the end of it, which is stripping everything down and looking at what life actually is, what the meaning of life actually is, the fact that the whole rest of it is a circus is so cool. Like, the idea that she took that to a different level, used that word, used that idea, and literally made it a circus so that she could strip it all away. I mean, it's kind of like life as a stage when in the original incarnation of Pippin, but I think that this re-envisioning it really helped it connect to modern audiences, and it allowed her to do some really super cool things with Pippin. And she completely changed that show through her direction. And Stephen Schwartz, the guy who wrote it, is even, quoted as saying that he loves what Diane Paulus did, and he feels it's a more true interpretation of what he originally wrote in Pippin. And so this director has come along and just made something absolutely amazing. Another example is the recent revival of Oklahoma. So we all think of Oklahoma as being this very, well, it's a classic. I mean, it is the classic in musical theater. And so we think of it as being this archetype of this, farmer and the cowman story of love, and we have good and we have bad, and by the end everything ends up happy. And this is our first super successful book musical, and it's quintessential, Rodgers and Hammerstein. But when it was adapted for the most recent revival, they said, let's look at Oklahoma and see if there's something that we're not getting at here, some part of the story that we can tell more clearly, so people don't just look at it and say, oh, it's Oklahoma. Let's strip it down and really try to get to the message of it and see if there's anything dark lurking in Oklahoma. And what they found was that, yes, there was definitely darkness lurking in Oklahoma, which if you any close look at the script would understand that through, you know, poor Judd's entire arc and everything. So they stripped the music down to playing instruments on stage, guitar and things like that, instead of all the huge orchestrations. And they adapted the scenes to being gunfights instead of knife fights, but they didn't change a single word of dialogue or of the songs. They upped the danger in Oklahoma, made it definitely more visceral experience and a more serious show based on their, you know, decisions of how they blocked it. They made everything, you know, the people, it was in the round, and so everybody was sitting around at this production. You should go look at pictures of this, by the way, if you haven't already. So they're much closer to the action, and then it's also much more dangerous because, you know, you have real guns going off in the show and raising that intensity level. And there's a real idea that, you know, there's blood in this version of Oklahoma. There's an idea that something really horrible actually could happen and maybe is happening. They completely re-envisioned the dream ballet to being, instead of it being one whole ballet that's showing what's going on in Laurie's head, her dream, they adapted it and changed it, and it's just one interpretive dancer. And so this director really changed the face of what Oklahoma is. And even if productions don't continue to utilize his changes, like, he did something super creative and made people look at Oklahoma in a completely different way. And so that's the hand that a director can have. And he didn't change a single word of dialogue. He didn't change a single lyric. He just used what he had and said, is there a way that I can tell parts of the story better, that I can focus on things better that may not have been focused on before? And I just think that's the coolest thing, when a director can do that, when they can strip away maybe what's been done before and look at, okay, what is the message of this story and how can I tell it? Another really interesting example for me is Sweeney Todd. So this is an example of how the original production and the original director thought it was one thing, but then it has taken on different incarnations and become successful in different ways. So Hal Prince was the original director of Sweeney Todd, and he was actually there helping when it was being written with Stephen Sondheim. And he was very inspired by this music and the darkness of the show and everything. And in his mind, it was very much a fable, a tale about British industrialization. And so he made the set and everything this huge industrialized complex, and you had pipes and you had different levels of things, and it was very complicated. And for him, all of it was a mirroring, was a parallel to British industrialization, and showing how different people were ruined by the industrialization of Britain, specifically Miss Lovett, and both, you know, and Sweeney Todd himself. But he played all of that. All of his direction was geared toward that. And there's a quote from Stephen Sondheim saying that he appreciated Hal Prince's vision, and he certainly loved it on stage and everything, but for him, Prince's interpretation of Sweeney Todd, while it definitely worked to get across his purposes for Sweeney Todd, which was to highlight jealousy and human nature, and Hal Prince's obviously interpretation clearly did that he never really connected with the idea of that industrialization thing. And so the original production of Sweeney Todd is iconic for what it did with that parallelism, and it's just so scary with those pipes and everything, the smoke going off. But then you have recent iterations of Sweeney Todd. The revival a few years ago with Patti LuPone and Michael Severus had the actors playing their own instruments, and it was a very stripped down version of Sweeney Todd. They never changed clothing. They played multiple characters. It definitely was not a realistic interpretation of it or telling of it. It was definitely playing more into the framing device of Attend to the Tale of Sweeney Todd, but it was equally scary, and it was equally effective at getting across that theme that Sondheim set up of jealousy and human nature. And then there was a recent off-Broadway production of Sweeney Todd that was set in a pie shop. And so the people were literally sitting feet from the actors, and it was very, very stripped down. And I've heard just amazing raves about how that production highlighted the themes in Sweeney Todd in a different way. So we have 3 different examples of Sweeney Todd. One is in a huge, grand metaphor for industrialization. One is stripped all the way back, and the actors are performers and in a, you know, all black, very macabre presentation. And then you have a pie shop presentation, which puts the actors extremely close to the people in the play, which are, you know, let's face it, a lot of times villains. So it's in their face and they're having to face it very closely. But each one of those is effective at telling this message in different ways. And I think it's so creative when people take a work like that and adapt it. And all of that is due to the directors. And so as a director, I really encourage you to look at whatever work it is that you're taking and try not to take it at face value. Try not to just, you know, go to YouTube and, you know, watch a production or something and say, well, that's exactly what I'm going to do. Now, if it's your first time directing, sure, it might be better to stick to what you know or stick to what you're familiar with. But as you grow in creativity, it might be a good example to just sit at home and look at different productions and think, what could I do with this? What could I do with this? And how would that get across the message of the show in a different way? Is there a way to do that? So, yeah, I think all of that stuff is just so much fun. And I love seeing when directors really put their own stamp on a show and adapt it and change it, and but allow it to be a more truer version of itself or a different version of itself, and get across different aspects of what the author is going for, just through a director's vision. So that's something I'd actually like you guys to do, is to go and look at shows that you may have directed before, that you may have been in before, and think to yourself, like, is there anything about this show that could be communicated better that maybe wasn't in the production that you saw? Are there any themes that you could highlight, and how would you do that in a creative way? Like I said, some things rely very heavily on the setting, and so maybe it's not the setting that you can adapt. A Cat on a Hot Tin Roof recently was revived on Broadway, and that setting of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof is fairly important to the telling of the story and a lot of the things that are going on. But the director decided to go in a different direction and hire and cast all African American actors for that. Well, suddenly some of the themes in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof take on different meanings and stuff like that. It's still set in the same place, still in the South, because the South is important to that, still in a similar time period, but now we're looking at it from an African American perspective, and the way they act it and the way that comes across will feel differently and will highlight different parts of that story. So these are just fun things to think about and to imagine when you're thinking about, can it be stripped back? Does it have to be a realistic portrayal of the show? Does it have to be realism? Can we put it somewhere that is not realistic? Or can we put it somewhere else that's still realistic but just a completely different setting? Like Natasha and Pierre and putting it in the Russian Supper Club. I mean, is there a different way to tell this story? My favorite example is probably, and I'll end with this, is probably Cabaret. And I think that when Cabaret first came out, obviously it was cutting edge, and they were doing things on stage that had never been done before. And, you know, you had Joel Grey being this MC. It was still set in Berlin. It was still everything that you thought it was going to be, as far as the seediness of this nightclub and everything. But it was still on stage in the 1960s, so it was going to be less seedy, less graphic than what the reality would have been, because that's what they're putting up on stage at that time period. When Cabaret came back out in the 90s with Alan Cumming, what they were able to do with that production and how they were able to blossom it. First of all, they were able to take some things from the movie that had not been in the original script, which obviously you won't have an opportunity to do as a director of a community theater production, but they were able to do that for this. But that's not the thing that changed the most about Cabaret. Really what changed the most about Cabaret is how much they leaned in to that gritty, dirty, seedy, but still dreamlike quality of this cabaret, of this place in Berlin before World War II. And it's just, they captured that mood so well. If you haven't seen it, go definitely search on YouTube for the opening scene of that Willkommen and see Alan Cumming perform that. And if you compare that, if you contrast it with Joel Grey, there's definitely more edge. There's definitely more, I would want to say fantasy about it. There's definitely an uncomfortable veneer about it, but I think it gets across the message of Cabaret even better than the original production did. And so sometimes you're just able to go further, take what the original production did and dive into it a little bit further, just because of time period or maybe what's happening in the world. Maybe you can push things that weren't able to be pushed before. So I love those moments and those times that directors can take something and really adapt it and tell the story in a new and interesting way. So I would love to hear shows that you know about where either the revival was very different from the first original creation of the show or iteration of the show that you think is cool, because, you know, I might not know about all of them. Those are just some of my favorites. And of course, I talked mostly about the female directors. Speaking of female directors, the new company that was supposed to open on Broadway has a female director. I think her name is Marianne Ellis. And she completely turned Company on its head and changed the genders of almost everybody in Company. So that's fun too. But I would love to hear about a time when you think a director was really super creative in their telling of a story, or a revival maybe that really changed things but told the story even better. So drop it in the comments below, or you can message me or message Wonderland and it'll get to me, and I would love to hear so that I can bring them back next week and talk about some of the shows that you have seen that had very cool or interesting directing choices. So a little bit of a short, fun episode for us today. I hope you guys have a great rest of the week. Happy Mother's Day, and to all the teachers out there, happy Teacher Appreciation Week, and keep going, and I'll see you next week with more play analysis. So, bye.